Good evening, everybody. My name is Anne, if I haven't met you before, and I'm very excited to be here with you for another Principles of Costing revision session. So over the past 3 sessions, if you haven't watched those yet, then I'd advise having a look through those. Over the last 3 sessions, we've actually run through an entire first intuition mock assessment. So you've now seen one of each question from an Principles of Costing assessment, so you have a good idea of what to expect in each task. Based on your requests, I've put together a few suggestions of what we might have a look at this evening, but we're going to be working now from the AAT practice assessments rather than from the first intuition ones. If you join in at home, lovely to have you. Thank you for watching. And yeah, I hope everybody, whether you are listening again or listening live, are going to take something away from this session. As always, if you are here in the class with me this evening, please pop any questions into the chat box. If you've got questions that you don't feel that you want to ask in front of everybody, just keep them till the end and we can do them when the recording's finished. So yeah, in today's session, just as a result of feedback from you, we're going to be trying to cover as much as we can from these 3 areas. So cost centres, we're going to have a look at absorption costing examples. We've got an AAT task that we can look at with some absorption costing in it, and then some labour cost questions as well, just to try to make you a little bit more confident about those areas. So we're going to start with a question from AAT sample assessment number 1. Which one is that one? That's here. Let me just open that one up. Here we are. So this is AAT sample assessment number 1. And task 3 in particular. You can ignore this reference to the 1.5 and 1.6. That was just us when we were going through the assessment and linking it to the various learning outcomes to make sure that we've got everything covered. So you can just ignore those bits there. So this is AAT assessment number 1 then. This is task number 3. And this is a great opportunity for us to revise some of the terminology around cost centre, profit centre, investment centre, and so on. So it asks us to identify which type of responsibility centre is the most likely for each of the scenarios below. Then it gives us 3 options in terms of responsibility centres. But because this is a revision course, we're going to revise those 3, and we're also going to revise the 4th one, which is a revenue centre. So let's just start by reminding ourselves what each of these phrases means. When we've done that, we can go to the question and try to link them as was asked. So I'm going to start with cost centre. And I'm going to remind you that a cost centre is really a collecting place for costs. So it's a part of our business that we want to collect costs for. It's part of the business that we want to monitor the cost of. And it's up to the organisation to decide if it wants to set up a particular part of its business as a cost centre. Because with a cost centre, what we are doing is we're saying the manager in charge of that particular department is responsible for controlling costs. They've got a budget. We want them to keep their costs within the budget, but we're not expecting them to sell anything. We're not expecting them to make any profit. This particular cost centre is a section where we're only responsible for keeping costs within the budget. So I might then say, for example, at first intuition, this might be the cost of our IT department. So they have to just keep the computers running. They have to make sure that everybody's got antivirus on their computer, that all our cybersecurity is up to date, and so on. They don't sell anything. First intuition sell accountancy courses, not IT services. So that particular department doesn't sell anything, but it is responsible for controlling costs. So that would be an example of a cost centre. A revenue centre is going to be a centre within our organisation where the manager is responsible for selling things. So I think maybe of, let's say a car showroom We might set that up as a revenue centre and say, as the manager of this car showroom, your job is to sell cars. I want you to sell this many new ones, this many used ones. This is your objective. Now, we're not really interested in the manager of that department controlling the costs, perhaps because somebody at head office is doing all of that. All we want them to do is sell the cars. So we set them up as a revenue centre and say, that's all we're going to assess you on. We're going to give you a target for sales. We're going to look at what you actually sold, and that's how we'll decide whether you're doing a good job or not. So it would be a revenue centre. Now, a profit centre would be like the cost centre and the revenue together. So if we made our manager responsible for both the cost of things and the revenue, then we would set them up as a profit centre. So a profit centre is where the manager is now responsible for the profit, not just the cost and not just the revenue, but the profit. So this manager has more responsibility than the cost centre or the revenue centre manager. And a profit centre might be, let's say, a First Intuition location. So First Intuition Leeds, First Intuition Cambridge. They could be a profit centre where the manager is assessed on the amount of profit that is made. And an investment centre goes one above that, and this is the highest level of responsibility for any manager, because now they have to make a profit, but they're also responsible for the capital expenditure budget. So they're also responsible for what is invested in their department. They might have to motivate to head office to say, we really need a refurbishment. It's going to cost $250,000, but we think if you refurbish our department, we can sell a lot more things and we can make a lot more profit. So our manager is actually responsible for spending money from the capital expenditure budget. The manager is responsible for keeping that budget on track, as well as being responsible for the revenue and the costs and ultimately the profit. So the highest level of responsibility up here in my investment centre. So it's just a generic explanation of what those 4 different departments or 4 different ways of managing our business might be. We call them responsibility centres because they relate to the amount of responsibility that each manager has. Now we've got, remember, the revenue centre was not actually part of the question. That was just me doing an extra bit of revision. So I have 3 options: investment, profit and cost. And I've got 3 individual scenarios. I've got an individual, a retail shop. I have an accounts department. I think it means like a finance department. And then the southern division of a manufacturing organisation with its own capital budget. And I need to use each of these options once. So one's an investment centre, one is a profit, and one is a cost centre. So being as we've just run through that, would you like to tell me which one you think should be which? What about the first one, a retail shop? Investment, profit, or cost? Yes, you're going with a profit centre, as would I. I gave you an example of a First Intuition department being a profit centre, but I think an individual shop, the shop manager should be deciding where to buy their supplies from. They should also be setting selling prices. So the manager of the shop should actually be responsible for the profit made by the shop. So I would go with profit centre as well for that one. Next, we have a accounts department. That doesn't sell anything, does it? I don't know, maybe you work in an accounts department in your company. So you don't sell anything to the outside world. You provide a support service, making sure the accounts are all paid, making sure the staff are paid, making sure that the profit and loss account is done, the management accounts are always in order. But this particular department within our organisation has costs. Of course, we have to pay the salaries of the staff, all the stationery, all the admin, but it doesn't sell anything. It has no revenue. It just incurs costs. So we set it up as a cost centre, which should mean that our last one is the investment centre. And the fact it refers to it being a division with its own capital budget is leading me towards that anyway. This particular department or division is responsible for its own capital expenditure as well as making the profit. So it's an investment centre. So that was the only one remaining. And actually, with this sort of question, you might find that there's one or two that jump out at you before the others. So pick off those ones first and then go back and see what's left to choose the others. So that was our revision of you said that the message I got from that was cost centers. So I thought we'd actually incorporate some revision around profit centers and investment centers as well. Any questions on that? Anything I can help anybody with in that area? Okay. Yes, absolutely. If that was an option, the retail shop could also have been a revenue centre. Yes, I think it could. It would be a revenue centre if we didn't want to make the manager responsible for the costs. So I often think maybe a profit centre is perhaps a little bit more appropriate for the retail shop, because the chances are they're also having to be responsible for buying in the goods that they sell. But perhaps, just as an example, perhaps if you are a McDonald's franchise and you're running a particular McDonald's shop, that could be set up as a revenue centre, because the costs are all pre-arranged, if you like. You get to decide where to buy your ingredients from. McDonald's head office will send you a truck with all the ingredients on there. So you're not choosing who to buy from. You're not choosing the quality of the ingredients that go into your products. You're just buying what head office sends you, and then you're trying to sell as much as you can. So that might be then appropriate to have a revenue centre instead. But the question will usually, as this one did, not give you both options if it thinks that you could choose one or the other. That, Linda, I don't know. I can only be guided by what the AAT sample assessments do, which in this case was there were 3 options and we chose each option was used once. Whether that's going to be the case in the real exam, I don't know. I can only show you what was in their practice assessment, and they haven't given us any guidance. Okay, Rebecca, again, the questions are not trying to trick you. So here, they specifically gave you an example of an organisation that had its own capital budget. If the retail shop said the retail shop manager has their own capital budget, then I would have chosen investment centre for that one as well. But I'm trying not to read beyond what the question has told me. So I'm going just on the data that I've been given. So unless they're telling me that this particular organisation or part of the organisation has its own capital budget, then I'm not really able to know that it's an investment centre. So I'm not saying that it wouldn't be, and I'm not saying that it couldn't be. I'm just saying in this question, I don't think it stood out as being an investment centre because that sentence was missing. Okay, good. So hopefully we've gained a little bit of clarification there on that area, and that's been useful for us. It's a very common problem, Michelle, but it will come in very useful as you make your way through future levels of AAT, where you'll be required to have a greater depth of understanding. So this sort of overthinking and trying to really understand what's going on is a great trait, and I never try to discourage it. It's just sometimes in the exam, it can cause you problems. So try not to do it too much in the exam. But in terms of your understanding of a topic, then great to ask these questions. Right. So one of the other things then that I believe that you wanted to look at was to have a look at maybe some absorption costing and some examples. So for that, we're going to go to AAT Practice Assessment 2 and Task 4 within that assessment. So because I'm going to send you as usual, I will email out the PDF of my answers. I'll make sure you know which is which. So this is AAT Assessment 2, and this is going to be task number 4. And this task is about overhead absorption rates, so basically absorption costing, which I think is something you wanted to look at, and also the behaviour of costs. I think this is a great little task, and I think that we've got to be careful with the first bit, that we don't now just rush in and read it too quickly and then get the wrong answer. We've got to make sure that we read it really carefully so we know exactly what's being asked. But let's have a look. It says this task is about calculating overhead absorption rates and looking at the behaviour of costs. And we've got to identify whether the following statement relates to fixed or variable costs. So it says a unit cost that remains the same with changes in activity levels. A unit cost means the cost of one unit. So if I was pricing up, let's say, a course, a Principles of Costing course, as an example, I'm looking for the cost of a unit that will stay the same even if the activity changes. So what sort of costs on my course might stay the same even if I get 10 bookings instead of just 5? Okay, remember you are looking at the cost of the individual unit. This is where it's so easy to go wrong with this one. You've got to look at the cost of one. So it's saying the cost of one unit is going to be the same, and it doesn't, what that means is each unit will be the same. So if we think about a course, as an example with First Intuition, let's say there's 2 elements to the course. One is that there's a tutor, and the other is that there's a folder of materials. So you get the tutor and you get the materials. This one is saying the cost of then we've got to insert the word, the folder or the tutor, is going to be the same for each unit, even when the activity goes up. So what that means is if I buy a folder for £35, then I get another booking, my next folder costs £35. And if I get a third booking, I have to buy another folder, also costing £35. So the answer it's looking for there is actually variable cost, because it's looking at the cost of each individual unit. It's not looking at the totals. And that's why we've got to be super careful how we read that particular sentence. So it starts there with the word unit cost. So the cost of a unit, the cost of one student attending the course is £35. That's the cost of their folder. It costs £35 per folder, whether I buy 1 folder or 100 folders. They're still £35 each. And that's the variable cost. This one, it says the unit cost varies with the change in activity levels. Let's see what that means. Let's imagine that our tutor is paid. Let's just make up a number here. Let's say the tutor is paid £500 for the course. So if we get 10 people attending the course, that would be equivalent to a cost of £50 for each student. So £50 per unit, if you like. Now, if the number of students on the course doubles, the tutor still gets paid £500 for the course, but they've now just got to teach 20 people instead. So the £500 now shared over 20 people instead is going to be £25 each. And on it goes. If we only had 5 students, the £500 cost would be shared over just the 5 students. So it would actually be costing me £100 per student to run that course. So what you can see there is that the unit cost, as in the cost of a unit, actually does vary as the activity changes. As the number of students goes up or down, my fixed cost, because that's what this is, it is fixed in total, but it changes with the activity level. So it's fixed in total and it changes as the activity changes. So we were looking for fixed cost there. But it's very important that we can see the difference between those two sentences. So it's because it mentions the word unit cost at the beginning that the way that we have to tackle that question is a little different. Is that okay? I think it's just the wording of that one rather than the actual principle that generally catches people out. Yes, it will have to, Michelle. Absolutely. It can't really just say cost, because then the answer could be either. So it needs to talk about a total cost or it needs to talk about a unit cost. Otherwise, we can't answer the question. Because if we changed the word in here and we said instead the total cost remains the same with changes in activity levels, your answer would then be, oh, well, if the total cost is the same, that must be fixed. And if this one said the total cost varies with changes in activity, then your answer would be, oh, okay, if the total cost is changing, that must be a variable cost then, because every time I do an extra unit, I incur an extra cost. So you get the exact opposite answer to this question if that had said total instead of unit. So it would have to specify. It's actually an easier question, I think, if it says total cost, because I think we work in total costs in our brain a little bit more easily, which is perhaps why they were testing the unit cost to see if we could get on top of that. Right. The next part then, Barrymore Limited produces a single product of which the following costs are identified. So there's some overheads, £95,000 in total for producing Barrymore's single product. Activity level is 2,500 units. And the business is looking how the different overhead absorption rates will affect the unit cost. So it's looking at overhead absorption rates. That triggers something in my mind. That makes me think of the formula that you will have learnt for the OAR, the overhead absorption rate. Can anybody tell me what that formula is? What do I divide by what? What's the OAR formula? Something divided by something. Do you remember? Very good. Well done. Well remembered. It is the overhead, in this case, £95,000, divided by the activity. And the activity is how we're going to choose to share that overhead. So there's a couple of different options here. We might share it based on units. We might share it based on hours. And if we do, they could be labour hours or they could be machine hours. So we've got three different ways at this level to be more when you continue with your studies, but we've got three for now. Three different ways that we can take that overhead and decide to share it amongst our production. Excellent. So well remembered with the formula. So we're looking at how the different overhead absorption rates, so units or labour hours or machine hours, affect the unit cost. It says if they use machinery instead of labour, it would require 2,000 machine hours. Very interesting. Let's look at the table and then let's see what they're asking me to do. They're showing me that there are three different alternatives in terms of the overhead absorption rate. I told you that there, but they're now telling me that anyway in the table. They're the three I'm familiar with. I could base it on units. I already know there's 2,500 of them. They've popped that into the table for me, very helpfully. If we use machinery instead of labour, there'd be 2,000 machine hours. They've popped that in the table, and they've also told me how many labour hours would be used as well. So I've got all three criteria in the table. So the little blanked out part is blanked out because nothing goes in there. The others are going to be filled in. So gap fill. Complete the table below to show what the overhead cost per unit would be at the three different OARs, three different overhead absorption rates. All values must be to 2 decimal places. So don't lose the marks by not doing the rounding properly. Let's make sure we do use 2 decimal places. Have we got some working space? I think we have. So if we do the OAR then first, let's do the OAR per unit. You told me that the formula was to take the overhead divided by the activity. Well, the activity is units on this first row, and the units are written right here as 2,500. So 95,000 divided by 2,500. Has anybody done that for me yet? £38. Fantastic. So the overhead absorption rate is £38. Let me see if I can squeeze it in somewhere you'll be able to read it a bit better. Let's put it here. So £38, which would mean the cost for 1 unit would be £38. You've already calculated the unit cost, so that's almost like a little trick question. There's nothing more to do. If it costs £38 for a unit, the OAR is 38, and then the cost of a unit is 38. So then that one's done. Then we have our OAR per labour hour. Labour hours are a little bit different because I've got an extra little gap fill box. The first thing it's asking me for here is how many hours do I spend making 1 unit? They call it the hours per unit. And I think I've told you before, if you always feel that you get muddled up with when to divide what by what, treat the little per as a division sign. So that would mean find the hours, 3,000. Per is the division. And then it says unit. So hours per, now a division, and units, 2,500. So if I divide 3,000 by 2,500, I think I've got an answer of 1.2, I think. Check you agree. Yep, I get 1.2, just tested it there. So 1.2, and that means I spend just over an hour, 1.2 hours to be precise, making a unit. Right, so that bit was a bit of extra. We didn't do that with the units because I was already in units, so I didn't have to. So I've now got 1.2 hours spent on each unit. The next bit is the OAR. That's no different in terms of our approach from when we did it before. It's still £95,000, but it's now shared over the labour hours, and there's 3,000 of them. So 95,000 shared over 3,000 hours. Oh, this is when we've got to get a bit clever with our roundings to 2 decimal places. I get an answer of 31.666666 and so on. So just a bit of a recap on roundings. If we want 2 decimal places, we will look at the 3rd decimal place to decide whether to round up or down. And that is a 6. So a 6 means I'll round up. So my answer becomes 31.67. So my OAR is 31.67. So what does that mean? That means that every single hour, because this is an OAR per labour hour, every single hour where my unit is getting some attention, it's going to cost £31.67 in overhead. Now, the last column says, well, how much would that be for a whole unit then? You're telling me it's £31.67 for 1 hour. What would it be for a whole unit? Does anybody know how I might find that out? It's £31.67 for 1 hour. How might I know how much it is for 1 whole unit? Any thoughts? Yeah, multiply by what, Linda? Yes, thank you. Multiply it by the 1.2 hours that I'm going to spend making this thing. It doesn't just take me an hour. It takes me 1.2 hours. So it's £31.67 for 1 hour, but it takes me 1.2 hours. So if I then multiply that together, it's going to be a cost of £31.67 multiplied by 1.2, £38. Same as the first one. No problem. That happens to me too. I'm doing a whole big list of things and then you look and it's just type nothing. It's like, what's going on? And it's just a numbers lock. Okay, so that's the OAR then for a full unit. £31.67 if it was just 1 hour, but it's not, it's 1.2 hours. So it needs a bit more. It needs £38. And then we've got the machine hours. Same idea, starting with the hours per unit. Remember what we said, take the hours, because I've got 2,000 of them, divided by the units. The per is like a divide. So 2,000 hours shared over 2,500 units. Let's see how long it takes in terms of machine time. And the answer is it doesn't even need a whole hour. We're talking about 0.8 of an hour. So it actually spends less than an hour getting machined, our product. What about its OAR? Well, we'll work that out in the same way that we worked out all the others so far. Taking exactly the same amount of overhead, but this time sharing it over the machine hours. There's 2,000 of them. So £95,000 shared over 2,000 hours would give me £47.50 per machine hour. So if it spends a whole hour, that would mean it would cost £47.50 in overhead. But does it take a whole hour? The answer is no, it doesn't. It takes 0.8 of an hour, not a whole hour. So it wouldn't be fair, a bit like a parking meter. If you don't park there for the whole hour, why are you paying there for the whole hour? You should only pay for the time that you're there. This unit should only absorb the overhead based on the time that it's there. And it's not there for a whole hour. It's there for 0.8 of an hour. So just like we did with the labour, we multiply together our rate for the whole hour with how long it takes. So £47.50, but it takes 0.8 of an hour. That would mean we would give it £38 of overhead. So it actually gets the same amount of overhead, irrespective of which method we've chosen, but the overhead absorption rate for each hour is different. It just ends up absorbing the same amount because of the respective amounts of time taken. So I think that's actually a very useful overhead question. And overhead was something that you said, I think, sorry, I'm just bending to turn a light on here. It's got a bit dark. I think that's a really great question to practice in terms of the overhead area. And I hope that you have found that one useful. I think it's a very good one because it has laid things out in a slightly different way. And it has actually got us to work through all three ways in which overheads might be absorbed: units, labour hours and machine hours. So this being the AAT assessment, of course, when you open it up again for yourself, it will be completely blank. You can have a go at it from scratch. If you get it right, excellent. If you don't get it right, then you can watch this video again and you can run through the workings again with me. Yes, Linda, I quite like the table as well. I just think it's good to be prepared, having seen sort of this table layout once before you just see it for the first time in the exam, which is why it's a really great idea to work through the AAT assessments. Is that clearer now, Michelle, or are you saying you're still a little confused with that one? A lot better. Good. Okay. So that's been a really useful example for us then, perhaps. And this is how things work. We get a rate for our unit, our activity, whatever it might be. Then we just have to decide how long it spends in terms of labour hours or machine hours and give it the appropriate amount of overhead. So I think that was a really good question for us to have a look at together. I'm glad we had time to do that one. I am just keeping an eye on the time as well. Okay. So you'd asked for some labour questions as well. So I think we'll move to those now. I do think that these AAT assessments are actually really great altogether. So please just make sure you work through them all. If you're looking for another little bit of overhead practice, then AAT assessment number 1, task 6B in particular, also talks a little bit about overheads. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Sorry, task 2. So AAT Assessment 1 Task 2 also deals with overheads. So that's just another one to look at if you know that's something that you've struggled with. So we are going to have a look at some labour examples then. Now we're in Assessment 2 here, so I think we might as well stick with this one. So we're not flipping between the assessments too much. So that was task number 4. So I'm going to go to task number 2. Just going to go backwards a little bit. Screen, it just needs a minute to catch up, it seems. There we go. So we go slow. It's task 3, so this must be task 2. Yeah. So task 2 has various things in. We're not going to do all of them. I was just going to sort of focus on the labour element of this. But this is AAT Sample Assessment 2. This is task number 2. And we're in part C. Okay. So with labour then, various different ways that our staff can be paid. Quite commonly, staff are paid an hourly rate. And it may be that they're paid for a standard, let's say 40-hour week, and they get paid £10 per hour for the first 40 hours. If the employer wants them to work a little bit of extra time there, maybe on a Saturday, they say, we know that you don't really like working Saturdays. So what we're going to do is we're going to incentivise you and we're going to pay you time and a half. So instead of just the £10 that you normally get, you'll get an extra half of that. So an extra £5. And that extra £5, we call it the premium. So the premium is the name for the bit over and above what the normal hourly rate is. So people can be paid on a time-based system based on the number of hours worked and then some overtime. And that's what's happening here in scenario A. Have a look at that one. Production staff are paid for 35 hours per week at £17.50 per hour. Any additional time is paid at time and a half. So they're getting their normal time is £17.50 and their additional time is time and a half. Would somebody like to tell me what their overtime rate of pay actually is then? How much are they getting paid for those extra hours if they are time and a half? What would that equate to? £26.25, I agree. It's a £17.50. And then half as much again. So £26.25. Excellent. And another very important distinction here, being as we're doing revision, is that that is now made up of 2 components. It is their basic or normal pay of £17.50, and it is an overtime premium. The premium is the extra 50%. So £17.50, the extra 50% is the extra £8.75. So they do get £26.25 altogether in overtime pay, but it's made up of 2 parts, their basic or their normal portion, and then their overtime premium. And I'm just stressing that just because other questions that we might see, and I've got another one for us to look at after this, might want us to split that pay into those 2 components. So we've established this one then is a time rate plus overtime. So that's the first option. The other options were piecework. Well, there's no mention of anybody getting paid per item here. And the other one is a guaranteed minimum payment. There was no mention of anything being guaranteed. They just get paid based on the hours they work. What about scenario B? Production staff are paid £10 for each unit fully completed. If this sentence stopped there, what would you say that is? If it just said production staff are paid £10 for each unit fully completed, what would that be? Exactly. That, if we stopped there, would be piecework. Because they're paid per item. They're paid for each unit that they complete. But because of minimum wage legislation and employee rights, employees are entitled to earn sometimes a guaranteed minimum amount. They've got to be able to earn enough to survive, and that's what's happening here. So they are in a piecework scheme, but they are actually guaranteed £600 pay at the end of the week. So it's not just a straight piecework scheme, that one, it is a guaranteed minimum payment. Lovely. So actually, in that little question there, we've managed to revise all three methods, because if the sentence hadn't mentioned the £600 minimum, I'd have said it's just a piecework scheme. But adding that £600 minimum on made it a guaranteed minimum payment. Now, thinking about what we know from the figures there, then it goes on to say 58 units were made in the week and they took a full 35 hours. So the staff worked for 35 hours and 58 units were made. Calculate, and I'll tell you a secret here. I got this wrong the first time because I didn't read it properly. Calculate the labour cost per unit. Not the labour cost in total, the labour cost per unit. That's what I didn't read. That's what we must read because it gives us a different answer. For each of these scenarios, round the answer to 2 decimal places. So, shall we start with scenario A? And shall we think about what the staff are going to be paid in total to start with? So, scenario A, we're told here, we work for 35 hours in the week. So what's going to be the total pay for scenario A? 35 hours at £17.50. Nobody actually gets any overtime because nobody works more than 35 hours. So we've just got 35 hours at £17.50 in total. The pay would be £612.50. Is that the answer to the question? No, because the question says, but what is the cost per unit? So remember, the per is like a divide sign. So take the labour cost, £612.50, per will divide by the number of units. That labour cost has to be shared out over the 58 units that were made. So yes, it did cost me £612.50, but I made 58 units for that price. So I get an answer to 2 decimal places of £10.56, if you agree. Yeah, well done, Michelle. Spotting we needed to divide by 58. Excellent. And have a look at scenario B and tell me, what do you think the total pay will be? Should just put a little column heading there for that. So what the total pay might be for scenario B. They do 58 units, £10 for each, £600 guaranteed minimum. What are they going to get paid in total for scenario B? Well done, Linda. Yeah, they're going to get paid £600. And the reason for that is because when I take the 58 units at £10 each, it only comes up to 580. And that's below that guaranteed minimum. So the guaranteed minimum now kicks in and our pay has to become 600 because they can't earn less than that. So we've got £600 also shared over 58 units. Also rounded to 2 decimal places. I got £10.34, if you agree. So I think that's a really interesting question. A really sort of different way to lay things out, and the fact that it asks for the labour cost per unit is very easy to miss. So when I worked this one out the first time, I just included the total pay, and I read it again and saw it said per unit. So I had to go that one extra step. It just shows the importance of reading the question fully. Okay, any questions on that one? There's 2 marks for that bit. So actually just 1 mark for getting each part right. Also 2 marks for part C as well. Well, I thought we'd stick with labour because I just wanted to show you, of course, the AAT assessments are designed to try to show you things in a variety of different ways, because that's not the only style of question that you might get on labour. So I thought we might have a look at the other one as well. So we're now just going to go back to AAT assessment number 1. And I'm thinking it's task 6. Let's find task 6 here. Sorry, the screen doesn't want to go at quite the speed I want it to. There we go. It's task 6, and it's actually task part B. So the first part is about FIFO and LIFO, as you can see. And it's here, part B. So starting from here. I'll label it up for you. AAT assessment 1. Task 6, it's part B. So let's see what they tell us. Nova Limited pays a time rate of £15 per hour to its direct labour workforce. So you'd say that's what we call their normal pay or their basic pay. It's just what they get for their normal time. So £15 per hour, thank you very much. And that's for the standard 35-hour week. Any of the workforce who work in excess of 35 hours is paid an overtime rate of time and a half. Very popular rate of pay for overtime. So they would get their normal £15 plus another half of that. The company is looking to compare the time rate, which we've just discussed, which is the overtime of time and a half, with a piecework rate, which would be £10 per completed unit. There's no mention of any guaranteed minimum. So we just assume the piecework rate is just £10 per unit, full stop. So complete the calculations in the table below for the both employees, enter the values to 2 decimal places. If no overtime premium is paid, you should enter 0 for that employee. So if there is no overtime, that's fine, but we have to say that there's no overtime. Otherwise, the examiner thinks that we didn't actually know how to answer the question. We've got to make sure that we fill the table in properly. Right. So we are going to need these figures from the top here then, and we've got to be very careful with this one because of the way that this table is laid out. So it tells me we've got a standard 35-hour week. So any hours in excess of that would be overtime. So starting with the first employee, Sada, they work 39 hours. So my immediate thought is they've done some overtime then. They've got 35 hours at normal pay and they've got 4 hours at overtime pay. So I've spotted already this person has overtime. Okay, Michelle, well, hopefully we can clarify that now. Another reason for actually doing this particular question. So there is more than one way that this question can be asked. The way that it's being asked by the AAT here is that they want to know not the overtime pay, they want to know the overtime premium. So remember, the premium is the bit over and above the normal pay. And I'm going to suggest we start with that. So the overtime premium. This person is going to get 4 hours of overtime. And what is the overtime premium? How much extra do they get for each hour? £7.50, yes. So the overtime premium is that extra half. So they get an extra £7.50. Their total overtime pay, which we're not actually asked for, but their total overtime pay would be the 15 and the £7.50 together. So it would be £22.50. So a question that asks you for the overtime premium wants you to say here that this person had 4 hours at £7.50. I can do that in my head. 15, £30. And what the question wants me to say here is that their basic wage, so it wants to know how much they earned in terms of this £15 an hour. And what it wants you to do is to say, well, actually, they had 39 hours where they were getting £15 because they had the 35 normal ones. And then they had the 4 overtime hours. They still got £15 for each of those as well. It's just they got an extra £7.50. So the basic wage needs to be the full 39 hours at £15. And if you have got the FI materials, we do give you 2 different question styles on this. This is definitely one of the question styles. And the reason we're doing it like this is because they've asked for an overtime premium, not the overtime pay. If they'd have asked for the normal wages and the overtime wages, then I would have had 35 hours in my first column and then the 4 hours in the second column at £22.50, but they asked only for the premium. And I know that the basic and the overtime need to add to the gross wages. And I know that this person then earns in total £615. So definitely something to practice, making sure that you are spotting whether it says premium or whether it's just asking for overtime pay. Okay. Now, JWeb is actually easier because JWeb doesn't have any overtime. So they're just a lot less complicated altogether. So let's do them. They just have 35 hours, of course, normal pay, £15 for each hour. But if you're going to ask me which is the most likely way to see it tested, I would say this way, because this is the way that AAT have chose to test it in this sample assessment. So I would suggest making sure you know how to answer the questions in this format. So no overtime for JWeb because they only work the exact number of hours. And their gross wage would be £525. Oh, really? I'll have to have a look at that then, Michelle. I thought that they were actually asking for the overtime pay rather than the premium, but they might have been changed since I last saw them. So I'll have a look. But I'm glad you managed to sort that out with Alison. Now, remember the point of this question was to do a comparison. It wanted us to compare what the wages were on a time-based system, which we've already done now here, with what they would get paid if we paid them piecework. And the piecework rate was £10 per completed unit. So this part is arguably a little bit easier because each unit just gets paid at £10. There was no mention of any guaranteed minimum. So 60 units at £10, or then 55 units at £10 gives us the piecework wages. Values to 2 decimal places. So I've used 2 decimal places throughout. I have actually put pound signs in, but I don't think they were needed. It's given us pound signs at the top of the question. So I didn't really need those, but I've added them in out of habit. So there we go. That would be another example of a labour question. So you've actually seen 2 examples now of labour questions. from both assessment 1 and 2. And we've seen that lovely overhead question as well, with both machine hours, labour hours and units. And we've also revised responsibility centres, cost centre, as well as profit centre, investment centre and revenue centre. So we've actually managed to get through quite a lot in our session. So I think the only thing that maybe you'd mentioned that we didn't have time for was the manufacturing accounts. But I will tell you that there are manufacturing account questions in here. This is one here. It's the spreadsheet one. But yeah, great one. This is task number 5 from AAT sample assessment number 1. So I would definitely suggest having a look at that. If manufacturing accounts is something that you're finding a little bit tricky, I think it is very much a test of memory, that one. I don't think there's all that much understanding required, really. A lot of it is actually just remembering what goes where I do feel that the other questions that we see, you need to be able to really understand what's happening, to understand how your answer is different if it says total or if it says per unit. Manufacturing accounts always look exactly the same, always in exactly the same order. Everything comes in the same order. Everything's always called the same thing. Everything's always added and subtracted in the same way. You get the pick list. So a lot of marks, and therefore definitely worth getting good at it, but definitely a test of memory. Yes, remembering to minus the closing ones. I think I might have used an example with you before on that one, Michelle, to help you remember. Maybe if I've talked about having a party and said, so you're having a party and you start off with an opening inventory of, let's say, 5 bottles of wine. But because you're having the party, of course, you need some extras. So you go to the shop and you buy an extra 20 bottles of wine. So at the beginning of the party, you've now got 25. At the end of the party, you take stock and see what's left. Maybe you had very thirsty guests and they've left you with just 1 bottle of wine. So what we're trying to work out is how many bottles of wine were actually used at the party. We started with 25, you've got 1 left. So 24 must have been used. So that's sort of just one way to sort of rationalize it in your mind. Start with the opening, add on whatever's happening in the period, and then deduct the closing. But often in these questions, it doesn't want you to use any sort of brackets or minus signs for the closing bit. So as you say, it makes it a little bit harder to remember to deduct it. But just keep practicing with them. I think that's a lovely one to practice. I want to maybe have a look at this assessment too and see if it also has a manufacturing account in, but I have a feeling it has something different. But that's a great thing about, oh no, it has got one as well. There you go. Also got one. So yeah, you've got 2 that you can practice just from the AAT assessments. That one's not quite as long, but definitely worth a look as well. So do please look over both of those. Letitia, help with the coding of direct and indirect things. If you have our revision question bank, we did talk about that in one of our other sessions. So you could go over the video perhaps for the session where we discussed that. And I'm just going to find the task for you here. Why? Always has these little moments where screen wants to go a bit slower. Oh, no, it's stuck. Right. Let me look it up in my folder because the screen is playing with us. Just want to see what task number it was, because what I was just going to tell you is this is the revision pack, the first intuition revision pack of questions. And task number 3, so we were nearly there. Here we are, yeah. So task number 3 is about coding, and you can practice there the difference between direct and indirect cost coding. And I think if you have a look at the task briefing, also in task number 1, then that gives you a little bit of extra background to remind you about direct and indirect costs. So have a read through the task briefing that goes before each task. There's some really great sort of just summarized hints and tips about what that task will cover. So I think that's something that might help you with that one. And just go back and have a look at when we actually covered that as a question together. And Michelle, yep, if you're talking about manufacturing accounts, then that would be a good summary of what's going on there. Manufacturing accounts, we have the opening, we add something, we deduct the closing, we get a subtotal. We add something, we get a subtotal. We add something else, we get another subtotal. We then add the opening, deduct the closing, get a subtotal. Add the opening, deduct the closing, get a subtotal. You just got to work out what those various subtotals are from the pick lists. That's where the memory comes in. And Aretha, you were asking which other formula do you need to know? In terms of what you need to know, I would say if you are looking for a summary, then do please just use our task briefings. See if this one's working yet. So before each task in our little question bank, we have this task briefing, which just gives you a few little notes about what will be covered in that task. But I think they are really great at sort of summarizing the syllabus and saying, so in summary, these are the main things to make sure you've learned. So if you're able to go to those task briefings and understand and learn what's in each of those, then I think you'll be pretty well prepared. Okay, I'll stop the recording there then. And if anybody then does have any additional questions or individual questions, I'm happy to help. Otherwise, we have now got to the end of our revision sessions. So it would just be left to me to wish you all the best with your live exam and hope that you might join us for some revision questions and revision sessions for other subjects maybe in the future. So